Hello? All right, sorry, now I'm back. But anyway, like I was saying, let me make sure my volume is up. My volume's up. All right, good. We're going. So, like I was saying, anyway, before my brief technological interruption there, in Kemet they had a pictorial script, and the pictorial script you can tell um, what symbols mean based upon what they resemble, right? So they're like slightly adjusted pictures. Now, there are a few things we got to remember about this pictorial script. The first one, and then I say this based upon my knowledge of other pictorial scripts in Africa, because the big thing is that these pictorial scripts are very characteristic of African culture. The phonetic scripts that we're all familiar with now are really more characteristic of Eurasian culture, but in Africa, typically, it's often said that Africans didn't have writing systems before Europeans came and saved us. That is, um, I would say that's false. However, most the writing systems we had don't fit most people's image of a writing system because they were pictorial scripts. An example of this would be Nsibidi and Uli in West Africa. It's used among the Igbo people. Those are two writing systems, and I'll get into the implications of that in a minute. It's used among the Igbo people, Bibio people, Efik people, and South in kind of the eastern part of West Africa and northern part of Central Africa, right? So you have those pictorial scripts. You have similar scripts all over. Basically, well, I won't say that, but I'm probably going to say most African groups had pictorial scripts like that. So the Comedian's pictorial script was simply another iteration of that. With the pictorial script, what you have to remember, one key thing to remember, is that they likely had several versions of it. And I say that because typically what you see in other African cultures is that one the like we refer to the comedian um, pictorial script or scripts as hieroglyphs collectively, but they might not have all been one script. There could have been multiple different scripts. Again, the example I gave of Nsibidi in West Africa, Nsibidi was used primarily by men, or is used, and Uli primarily used by women. Could have been a similar thing in Comedian culture. And then on top of that, there could have been a public version and a private version. A public version that would have been used um, by people in their everyday lives to communicate things, and a private version that would have been used by secret societies and um, secret learning institutions, which I'll go into in a second. So that's one thing to consider. And also, modern Western archaeologists, to my knowledge, have not been able to completely decode the Comedian pictorial script. But I would not be shocked if the Africans who are descended from the Comedians, and some of them still call themselves Comedians, so but I'll get into that more in a second, of course. I know what it means, they just don't want to tell them. Partly, maybe they just don't want to tell outsiders, and also partly as part of that even internal secret society thing I'm talking about that you see in most African cultures. The other thing to keep in mind is that the pictorial script likely allowed comedians to communicate with other peoples around them who didn't speak the same language. Because again, what you see with other pictorial scripts in West Africa is that because they depict ideas and not sounds in a specific language, you can have two people who speak a different language can communicate using the pictorial script. Because as long as they know what idea certain symbols depict, then they'll know what it's saying, even if the person who wrote it speaks a different language. So it's likely, in my opinion, that the Comedian hieroglyphs allowed for cross tribal communication. Um, Now, another thing to consider, again, going back to the subject of the secret societies, is how this would have done the Comedians' pictorial script would have dovetailed with their education system. We know that the Comedians had things called mystery schools. These are the same thing as what are called masquerade societies in other parts of modern Africa. And what these really are actually schools, institutions meant to teach people things. Um, because in most African societies historically, um, education was done in this way. So prepubescent kids um, didn't go to any formal education institution. It's not like in modern society where your 5 year old goes to school. They wouldn't do that. They just be out living their lives. However, the community and the society were structured in such a way that they would naturally teach these kids things. So education would be weaved into children's games, into songs. Um, there would be traditions where older kids would come and tell stories to younger kids, and the stories are fun, but they actually would contain a lot of knowledge. And the kids would learn that way, often without even knowing. Then, when the children got older, probably about beginning at puberty, began to undergo the rituals of becoming men and women. Because again, like in most African societies, I'm sure that the comedians had rites of passage for kids, certain rites of passage for men, certain rites of passage for women, and then of course that could be flexible if they're individuals who weren't like most men or weren't like most women. But anyway, that would be the structure. So as you began those rituals, you would a child would know what profession they wanted to enter. And again, this the belief was that children are born into the world perfect. It's not like now when you think that a child's born, they're confused, they don't know anything, they need to be molded. I believe the child is born perfect, and therefore, if they follow their intuition, they'll live the best life possible. So whatever the child intuitively wants to do is what they would be encouraged to do. So, say a child would intuitively want to be a blacksmith, or intuitively want to be an athlete, or intuitively want to be a sculptor, whatever it may be, then they could enter a well, first there was an apprenticeship system, right? So then they could go work for an older person who did their desired profession, learn from them. But then also they could enter these mystery schools, and again, those I need to look up the exact way it worked out, but I'm sure the just again because of how other African societies are structured and the general similarity of African cultures, that the Comedian society, that apprenticeship system, and this mystery school system would be intertwined. But what I do know for sure is that in these mystery schools, right, um, people would be bound to certain oaths and would have to keep certain secrets. They'd have to undergo certain initiation rituals. And in these mystery schools, what they would actually do is they would learn from teaching spirits. When I say teaching spirits, I mean literal spirits. I'll go into the comedian uh, scientific and metaphysical beliefs in a second, but they very much knew about spirits. Um, so then these teaching spirits, people would be, I mean, either maybe they'd be exceptionally spiritually gifted, they could just see them, but in most cases they'd probably be induced into a state where they could see the teaching spirit, and then they would learn from the teaching spirit. So then yeah, that was the process. And then along with that, they would also learn from older members in society. They would or in the mystery school, and in that way, that's how people would get educated, and they would specifically get educated with whatever profession they chose. And then obviously the hieroglyphs and the pictorial script be involved in that. They'd be used to communicate knowledge, and surely there were certain meanings and symbols that people would learn in specific mystery schools that they weren't meant to share with people outside of that mystery school. So that's the Comedian education system and how it would dovetail with the pictorial script. Now, because I just mentioned it, I might as well go into the Comedian belief in science and metaphysics. Now, a lot of people get confused um, when they encounter Comedian science and metaphysics because they mistake it for what in the modern day we refer to as religion. So they'll hear them talk about entities like Ra, Aset, Horus, and think, oh, these were their gods. They were worshiping them as part of their religion. But that was not happening. These were actually names they gave to different forces of nature. So, like Ra, people commonly say it was the sun god. No, when they said Ra, they either meant the sun or a force that was associated with the sun. They're talking about natural phenomenon, right? When they talked about things that Westerners and modern day scholars would call the earth god or goddess, no, they were talking about the earth or some actual fundamental force associated with the earth. And I know this because that was true of virtually every African society. The concept of gods and goddesses are much later Eurasian concept. You could arguably even say it's an Abrahamic religion concept. That's a different subject, but essentially these are not gods. These are just forces of nature that they interface with and interacted with. Many other modern scholars um, might have noticed it's not religion. We're in the habit of saying that in the Comedian system that these things are simply principles. They were just metaphors that they were using to um, connote certain ideas. But again, um, based upon my study of other African cultures and um, the conversations and you know, um, I guess sources and videos, things like that, that I'm familiar with people who know even more than me on these subjects. Those scholars who made that claim, and modern day scholars and other people make those claims, just simply are incorrect. These forces they were talking about were not metaphors; they meant it literally. They just simply had scientific knowledge that we don't have now. There's one thing you have to keep in mind when learning about the ancient world is that essentially we live in a time in modern times of scientific backwardness. So we assume that we know way more than people from ancient societies, but in reality we know less, and that's in another lecture I'll cover that. But um, all I'll say is that they came to these conclusions about these various forces by thousands upon thousands of years of observation, and they were able to apply that knowledge to great effect. So we should take what they said seriously and not dismiss it as some sort of superstition. But anyway, um, so that was Comedian science and metaphysics. I do need to look more deeply into exactly how they expressed everything, the nuances of everything they said. But based upon I've heard from people who've studied it and my knowledge of other African cultures and knowledge of the similarity, I can confidently say um, that they were describing fundamental forces of nature, and they would have also believed in things like reincarnation, um, you know, divine masculine, divine feminine energy, things of that nature, and they've applied that. And they applied that to all aspects of their life, obviously, but I think one of the most famous areas they applied it to was medicine. Um, in the West, we're often taught um, that what's his name? That oath, Hippocrates. This Greek dude was the father of medicine. However, in Hippocrates' own writings, he said that he was a child of Imhotep, and Imhotep is regarded as the uh, father of Comedian medicine, right? And healing, and also other scientific subjects. Now, I do have my questions about. Now, I think Imhotep certainly existed. I have my questions about whether or not Imhotep was a human being. Because again, going back to the subject of the mystery schools and a conversation I recently had with someone who researches ancient societies. The teaching spirits in these mystery schools were often named and get mistaken for human beings in um, modern scholars. Like for example, this person told me that Socrates, the supposed famous Greek philosopher, was actually a teaching spirit that people communed with in a mystery school in Greece. So because Imhotep was credited with so much, I'd have to look into it, but I wouldn't be surprised if maybe Imhotep was a teaching spirit that they channeled for knowledge. But if not, a great human being. But anyway, the point is whether they came through it by purely human hands or they had help from a teaching spirit. Um, the comedians had great knowledge of medicine. They also had great knowledge of astrology. Um, they had extensive knowledge of mathematics, um, which of course they used to build the pyramids. And of course, the pyramids, what the comedians are most famous for, the structures still are in their homeland today. These are, of course, tombs for their pharaohs. But based upon my research and my what I've read of other people's research, those things also likely serve to channel the creative first force of the earth, um, because all things in the world have a creative force. In Igbo, it's known as Omumu. I don't know what the comedians would have called it, but since they were scientifically advanced, they would have recognized this. And essentially, those kind of pyramid structures are usually made to channel that creative force. So I highly suspect, based off what I've heard from other people who've researched this, that the pyramids they built not only would have served as a tomb, but also would have been meant to channel the creative force of the earth for some purpose. Maybe that just generally enhanced the, the creativity of the people, um, the health of their crops, whatever it may be. Um, but nonetheless, that looks like what that also was. But going back to mathematics, you would have had to have extensive knowledge of mathematics and architecture, obviously, to pull that kind of thing off. Um, it's often said that the pyramids were built using slaves. That might have been true because there was slavery in Comedian society. However, it wasn't, um, as widespread as what you would see in later Eurasian dominated societies. But there was some slavery, forced labor. Um, but I've also heard from some sources that it wouldn't have been slave labor. Not sure. I'd have to look into that. But nonetheless, whether or not it was built by fortunate or unfortunate means, it clearly displayed their intellectual um, prowess. Um, yes, so that's the comedian belief in science or knowledge of science and metaphysics and how they applied it. Now, into the related subject of religion, again, as I said, the things that I'm talking about commonly get mistaken for religion in regards to metaphysics and science, but they're not. In regards to religion, Kemetic society was generally not a religious society, because the concept of religion generally was not um, it was just not practiced, might not have even been known about because historically you could debate whether or not religion as a concept had even entered the human world at this point or not. Of course, that's another debate. There were some certain cults, like I believe there was a cult of Amon in Kemet that you could argue was a religious cult. But basically, that would have been, even if that was a religious cult, I'm not totally sure it was. It That's something that a minority of people in the society would have done, and certainly that's not something that was generally done in the tens of thousands of years of this civilization's existence, because these scientific and metaphysical principles, again, they tell you how things are, but they don't tell you what to do. Comedians would have applied these principles based upon their own individual knowledge and desire to do whatever they want. That doesn't mean, of course, they didn't have a code of conduct and morals. They did. It just didn't derive from what you'd call a religion. Um, so they were spiritual, and when I say that, I simply mean not in the connotations of modern. When someone says in the modern sense, that kind of gives you a sense that you're just doing religion on your own. That's not what I mean. I mean they were spiritual in that they knew about the existence of spirits and interface with them as needed. They were scientifically knowledgeable, not a religious society. So next, I want to talk about the agriculture of Kemet, and of course, and really, I'll just talk about the economy of Kemet, and it was heavily centered around the Nile. The Kemetians had a love-hate relationship with the Nile. They loved it because it made the soil around it so fertile, and from there they can grow various crops and also various natural plants grew in that area, and with that comes animals, and you have a lot of to eat, things like that. But then the hate relationship came with the Nile flooding, and of course the floods could be quite destructive. They learned to live with that, but it still could be unpleasant, could create headaches for them. But interestingly, they never damned it or tried to stop that. They just accepted that as a part of life that they had to deal with. And their society was very healthy for it. You can contrast that with now that on the Nile you have dams like the Aswan Dam that have caused massive ecological damage, and you really wonder if the people living in that region today should draw from the knowledge of the ancient Comedians and live as they lived in regard to the Nile. But anyway, the Nile was a major source of economic prosperity because of um, the crops that allowed them to grow. They also were avid traders. People would come from far and wide because of the wealth of Kemet to trade with them. They had immense natural resources. Um, you know, gold. Comedians were said to wear gold all the time because, again, going back to science and metaphysics, they knew that gold had certain properties that could raise the frequencies in a human being to enhance health. So they used it for that health purpose. And other people who wanted gold purely for money purposes, Eurasians who came there were shocked when they saw that the Comedians had so much gold and didn't really bat an eye at gold because there was so much there. So it was a very resource rich land. And because of that, that led to great economic and political influence of Kemet. And I'm going to transition now to talk about Kemet's relationships with the peoples around them. So first, if you were to look down the Nile and the upper Nile, right, the Comedians' closest neighbors were the Nubians, right, and the Nubians were actually the parents of the Comedian people. And by that I mean that the Comedian people, or Kemet as a civilization, was founded by migrants from Nubia. So, in other words, Nubia is to Kemet what Britain is to the United States. Um, but Nubia and Kemet, always had a tense relationship. They were always fighting wars back and forth. And in fact, several of the Comedian dynasties were actually founded by Nubians who invaded and took over. So think like if Britain and the United States never resolved their differences and kept fighting wars against each other. That's kind of what the relationship was like. Um, but their relationship, there were periods of peace between the Comedians and Nubians. And we have to also keep in mind that at this point, warfare was not as brutal as it is in the modern era for a couple reasons. One, Comedians, like vast majority of Africans, took killing very seriously because, again, their metaphysical knowledge told them, as I mentioned earlier, that killing really both upset and harmed Mother Earth. And because of that, if you killed someone, you could be severely punished, and your family and community could be severely punished. So that's not to say they never waged war and killed people, um, but they were very hesitant to do that. So they warred a lot less generally over the course of their history than modern societies do. And when they did war, the wars were less brutal. The death tolls weren't as high. That's one thing to keep in mind. Um, but also they would, they would often, resolve the wars more quickly and peaceably than people do now. Um, there wasn't necessarily the same kind of total warfare. So that's something to keep in mind when you're talking about conflicts between Kemet and other people. Um, and of course, there are periods of peace between them and Nubia. But then the Nubians weren't the only people they interacted with. The Comedians, remember, they're Nilotics, like I said earlier, very tall African peoples, black peoples. But they had great respect for pygmies, who are, of course, um, are the people that are commonly referred to as pygmies now. Uh, I think I'll call them pygmies for lack of a better term. Forgive me, anyone in that category who I'm who's listening to this right now, but it's just there's not